Welcome to a new episode of Conversations with Commissioners. My name is Nguyen and I'm the Chairperson of the Victorian Multicultural Commission. Here at the VMC, we strengthen cultural diversity in Victoria through community consultation, advocacy and celebration. We bring people together to share, celebrate and preserve our diverse cultures for future generations. Conversations with Commissioners is our thought-provoking conversational podcast about current issues through a multicultural lens. With International Women's Day on the horizon, I'll be chatting with Dr Niki Vincent about all things gender equality, women's achievement, and touching on this year's theme, Break the Bias. I'm particularly interested in exploring the intersectional aspects with Dr Vincent's work, especially for our multicultural communities. Dr Niki Vincent is Victoria's first public sector gender equality commissioner, first in Victoria and indeed first in Australia, who joins me today for the first episode here on Conversations with Commissioners. Hello, Niki.
Hello, Viv.
Well, let me address you, Dr. Niki Vincent. For those listening at home, could you please give a quick introduction about yourself and the amazing work you do at the Commission for Gender Equality at the public sector?
Thank you. Sure. I come to Victoria as a real newbie. This is my first time living and working in Victoria for this very exciting role. Previously, I was the Equal Opportunity Commissioner for South Australia, and I watched this act come to fruition, the act that I administer come to fruition, and was very excited about it and what Victoria was doing. So as I say, it's a very exciting position for me. These last two, this role and the previous role, my first time sort of working in statutory roles inside of government. I'd really had no government or very little government experience prior to that. I'd run not-for-profit organisations, including the equivalent of Leadership Victoria that I set up in South Australia and ran that for 13 years. So that's a bit about my background. My team and I implement the Gender Equality Act in Victoria, which is brand new and really groundbreaking. The Act requires, the Act covers 300 organisations in Victoria, so all of the public sector, the public service and the broader public sector, all universities and all local councils. So 300 organisations, about 380,000 people are covered by the Act, and it requires three things. So organisations must undertake a workplace gender audit across 7 key indicators, including composition at all levels of the workforce and in governing bodies, workplace sexual harassment, gendered segregation within their workplace, recruitment and promotion practices, leave and flexibility, and the gender pay gap. They must submit all of that data to us, and then they must consult their workforce in the development of gender equality action plans to address any inequality that they find. And those plans are about to be submitted to me on the 31st of March. They also have to report on their progress, and they have to make reasonable and material progress every 2 years. So their progress reports will come to me in 2023. And they must also undertake gender impact assessments on all policies, programs or services, all new policies, programs or services that have a direct and significant impact on the public. But that's it in a kind of big nutshell.
And I'm so pleased that you are taking the role, leading the implementation of what is Victoria and Australia's and some aspects of this legislation first. Well, we're chatting today and coming together for International Women's Day. The theme for this year is Break the Bias. And there are a couple of comments that come with the theme. Imagine a gender equal world, a world free of bias, stereotypes and discrimination. A world that is diverse, equitable and inclusive. A world where difference is valued and celebrated. And together we can forge women's equality. What are some of your preliminary thoughts, Niki, when you hear these messages?
Well, the insidious thing about bias is that it is often unconscious, and so people often aren't aware of their bias, and we all have biases. We all, every one of us has grown up in a particular culture that has its own kind of gender stereotypes, and those create biases and gendered ways of looking at things, and so. I mean, we think of bias as a bad thing, but it's actually something that we all have, and the way that we can handle our biases is to understand what they are, and then to deal with them, or understand the potential pitfalls that we might fall into when making decisions because of our biases. I tell a story actually about the implicit assumptions tests that Harvard University has online that you can do, and I went in to see if I had a racial bias. This was way before I was commissioner here or commissioner in South Australia. And I found that I didn't have a racial bias, and it basically gets you to associate pictures of people with particular words and the speed at which you do that. And so what I found was I didn't have a racial bias, which I was very pleased about. So I thought, oh, big tick there, I'll go and do the gender bias. And I went in and did the gender test and found that I, in fact, had a gender bias. I was more likely to associate words such as leadership and agency and decision-making with men, and quicker to associate words about caring and so forth with women. And here I am, Gender Equality Commissioner and previously Equal Opportunity Commissioner. So we all have biases, and the most important thing is to understand them and understand what impact that they can create. But when we don't understand them, we can often make biased decisions, and we've seen that in recruitment. We've seen so many studies where the same CV has been given to a group, identical CVs, one with a female's name and one with a male name, and the male always gets ranked more suitable for the job when it's a sort of male-dominated area or job, and likewise the woman if it's a sort of more a job that's more likely to be associated with a woman. So it's extraordinary. That kind of research just lays that unconscious bias bare.
Thanks very much for that reflection, Niki. Indeed, and like you, many of us have become so familiar with the term unprecedented, because despite all of the experiences that we've had, many of such experiences have had to be thrown out the window with this pandemic. But you've done an amazing job in setting up the team, the commission, and bringing the public sector with you. 67 million data points. That is an amazing number, and I wish you well in trying to unpack the data sets, Niki, and making sense for all of us. Now, let me talk a bit about the intersectionality. We hear that term a lot, Niki, but many of us may not fully appreciate what that means. If you can help us unpack what that means and what's been some of the interesting trends and opportunities you're observing from the work thus far.
Sure. So when we think of intersectionality, and gender equality, we're looking at how people experience gender inequality and how that's different based on how it intersects with other aspects of their identity. Intersectionality is enshrined within the Gender Equality Act, and it's the first time that it has been enshrined in inequality law in Australia. And we can't find it anywhere actually else. And so what we're doing is we're asking all organisations with obligations under the Act to consider intersectionality in their workplace gender audits and in their gender equality action plans, and also when they're undertaking their gender impact assessment. So it's kind of like gender impact assessment plus, because it considers intersectionality. So things like race, gender identity, disability, they're the innate characteristics, but we're also looking at rurality and parenting in our research. I have a research agenda as well, and so we're doing a lot of research on intersectionality over the next 12 months. We're just about to put out another round of funding.
Let me just touch on the gender pay gap, which has been in the news of late. In 2020, the VPS gender pay gap was 10.7%. Is there any data from your work thus far that talks about the pay data gap regarding women from different cultural backgrounds? And could you also help shed some more light to the audience on this particular figure?
So the gender pay gap measures the difference between the average earnings of women and men in the workforce. It's an internationally established measure of women's position in the economy in comparison to men. And the gap is the result of social and economic factors that combine to reduce women's earning capacity over their lifetime. And so closing that gap is not just it's not about just ensuring equal pay. It requires a cultural change to remove the barriers to equal participation of women in the workforce. And I would have to say that we have such limited data for multicultural women right now, although that will change with the Gender Equality Act. We know that women from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds are overrepresented in low-paid work and insecure work, and that migrant women are 7% less likely to be employed than those born in Australia. But because of the data gap, we really don't understand why, and we really only, it's really only the tip of the iceberg. KPMG do these fantastic reports every few years called She's Priced Less, which I think is a great title. And they found that the gender pay gap for white women, and they did it in America, they found that the gender pay gap for white women when compared to a white man in the US was 20%, but the gender pay gap for black women was significantly higher at 35% and 38% for Hispanic women. And so we can assume that there are similar disparities in Australia, but we don't yet have the data to prove it, but we will.
That's really great to know. So we really look forward to unpacking the figures, the headline figures, as well as the various aspects and elements underneath these numbers. Thank you, Niki. And you do have a pretty strong and powerful mandate there to help drive the gender equality on all aspects, and we are really keen to work with you on that. Now let me turn to the next section of our conversation, what is called Questions from the Community segment. We asked our Victorian Multicultural Commission Regional Advisory Committee members, and there are over 200 members in those committees, the Multi-Faith Advisory Group members, and the broader community networks on what questions they'd like to ask of you and I. More for you, Niki, given that the conversation today is about gender equality, for which you have significant leadership and responsibility. Let me just go to a couple of those. The first one is from the community is this, and I'm quoting them verbatim. How do you ensure for both your team and the community more broadly that there is safety and inclusion for people with intersecting identities or experiences? For example, people of colour, people with disability. Thanks, Niki.
That's a great question. Thank you. At our commission, we focused really on building a strong culture of psychological safety. We're all still learning, and we continue to learn, but making sure as much as we possibly can that team members feel able to raise any concerns and questions that they have around anything, in actual fact. I mean, psychological safety is broad. I think it's really important to ensure that you have diversity and not just a single person ticking a box, because it can be hard being the only one in the room. I'm using my hands with inverted commas, which of course you can't see. I'm pretty strong on this because at the Leaders Institute of South Australia, and we ran the Governors Leadership Foundation program, which is like the Williamson Community Leadership program here in Victoria. I noticed a real lack of diversity in the leadership room, if you like, as we ran these programs. And so I created a scholarship program to bring in more women of colour, more Aboriginal women, more people with disability and so forth. And those scholarships were very successful so I would say there's a particular scholarship, the fee was about $12,500 to do the program. So we would have scholarships that were funded by sponsors and so forth. And it was dramatic. It really increased the diversity. And a lot of the time, the scholarships people didn't need the scholarships, but just having the scholarships meant that they recognised that we were looking to be more diverse and inclusive in our leadership programs. And so often we couldn't actually use all the Aboriginal scholarships, but we had a dramatic increase in Aboriginal people within the program and so on, and the same with our disability scholarships. It was just a signal to people that they were important and that we did want them to be part of the program. And I think that's really important for all organisations to consider.
It's the signal, the symbol, the leadership that people see that will then draw them towards the organisation or the work that you do. It's really, really good point. I'll go to the next question, and I'm reading them out verbatim as well for you, Niki. Intersectionality teaches us that our experiences are informed by the way in which our many identities intersect. How can those of us who enjoy certain privileges, often based on our proximity to whiteness or being male, upskill, empower and build capacity of those who experience compounding level of disadvantages or barriers? An example that was given was an Asian male noting the disadvantage he may face because of his ethnicity and acknowledging his privilege as a male in a patriarchal society working alongside a black female.
Trying to unpick all of that, I think that, if you are an Asian male, then noting the disadvantage you might face because of your ethnicity and acknowledge your privilege as a male in a patriarchal society can be a good starting point. But I would also say in relation to that question that I probably wouldn't assume that others with intersectional identities need upskilling, empowering or capacity building. I think it's really important not to assume disadvantage. But I think in terms of, the intent of this is, what can we do to educate ourselves? And I think educating ourselves is so critical. Reading, asking questions, listening and raising issues for discussion if you think you see them, and hopefully if you've got a climate of psychological safety in your organisation, you can do that. But I also would say that data from organisations that are covered by the Gender Equality Act will help make these issues more transparent. So as we have intersectional data, we'll have evidence. To be able to call out issues at an evidential basis for that. It'd be interesting to see what you think, Viv.
Yeah, I suppose from my perspective, it's one that's I'm pretty familiar with. For people who come to Australia from a non-English speaking background or from a non-Anglo-Saxon background, I think our country, and certainly in Victoria, we've come a long way from recognizing diversity and from also embracing diversity. I think for me, the ongoing education, that continued awareness and that commitment to diversity is a critical element to making sure that we can call it out. And the way that we can call it out comes from leadership, experience, confidence, courage, and a supportive environment. And you've talked about a culture of safety and inclusion, for example, in the workplace, Niki. Those elements to me are important. Individually, we can learn all sorts of things and we can do all sorts of things. But as a society, we need to have those cues. And those cues can be legislation, leadership, support, all of which I'm seeing a great deal in Victoria, and especially in the last couple of years with the pandemic as well, despite the difficult circumstances. So there it is, my response, Niki. Let me go to the next question. If you can have quotas and targets for gender equality, why can't we have it for people, and particularly women of colour? Often, if there are only limited seats on the table for women, it is unlikely that a woman of colour will get preference.
There's no reason why we can't have targets to increase diversity. I think intersectionality is really important. For example, white men are less likely to be overlooked for leadership positions. Setting a target based on a gender binary creates further challenges for women of colour in particular, because as you say, it's not enough to replace a white man with a white woman, and yet too often other forms of diversity aren't taken into account. And I think a woman of colour was talking to me recently and said that when she raised that issue on a board that she was on, that there was she was the only woman of colour, and why hadn't they considered cultural diversity when appointing a couple of new board members. They said our focus is gender diversity, not cultural diversity. So people have a simplistic view, I think, often of these things. And intersectionality, I think probably Victoria is ahead of the game in terms of understanding that. I certainly think that it's a difficult concept. It really complexifies things. And if you're already struggling with gender inequality, adding in those extra layers can seem a bit overwhelming, but it's absolutely crucial that we do that. And as I said before, we've got the Gender Equality Act gives us the ability to set targets in consultation with sectors, with community and stakeholders. And there's no reason why that couldn't include intersectional workplace gender equality.
That is so true. Sometimes we look at things in a binary sort of manner, and we have to do this first, then we take the next steps. And that's why the Act is so important, Niki, and that's why data, which you've got, and I'm still baffled by these 67 million data points that you've got there, Niki. But having data to really understand the how deep the issues are and what we know about our own biases. And as you've mentioned before, Niki, we all have biases. We all have things that we can learn and unlearn. And it's important to help that the data will help us with that. And that will certainly go a long way. Now let me go to the next question, and I think this one is for both of us. How has International Women's Day changed or evolved over time to better recognise and include culturally diverse women, and what could still improve? Would you like to have a go first, Niki?
Well, I think we've all got better at recognising and including culturally diverse women. I think there was a lot written about feminism, excluding culturally diverse women. There's tomes written about that, and I think we've all become much more aware of those issues. And I think we still have a long way to go. I mean, just the fact that we don't have data on the pay gap for women of colour and so forth just speaks volumes to the fact that we still aren't taking this seriously enough. And I think International Women's Day is no different in that regard.
To add to that, my observations around International Women's Day is that it has helped create greater awareness and visibility for women from different culturally diverse backgrounds. But I think it's been a bit haphazard. We haven't got to a critical mass of women of colour in leadership. We often are the first to do something, so to achieve something. I wish that we don't have to be given the title of the first of something. So I'm hoping and hoping to contribute to that over time, over the coming years, that it would just be part of our landscape in exactly the way that we see our community and our society, that a woman of colour being appointed to a position or achieving a certain milestone isn't the first or the second or the third. It would be, that's how it is. And to the final question of our segment on questions from the community as part of this podcast, Conversations with Commissioners, and I am talking to Dr. Niki Vincent. And here comes the question. The Victorian public sector can be quite male Anglo-dominated. Could you share some of the challenges you have faced in your career and what you did to overcome that? What advice could you give to young females from a multicultural background who feels overlooked at work, and how to change the mindset of quote unquote a boys' club?
I think that question might be for you, because I think they're looking for some of the challenges that you might have faced in your career, Viv. But I can certainly talk to the advice for young females from a multicultural background who feel overlooked at work. I think in the Women of Colour network in the Victorian public service has done a lot to raise visibility and raise issues, and is working incredibly hard as a voluntary network to try and deal with the issues for women of colour. And I certainly I have several members of my own team who are part of that network, and I think feel great support from being part of that network. But I think that how to change the mindset of a boys' club is that's what we're all trying to do, really. There's no one silver bullet solution to that. And I think just keeping yourself informed, keeping yourself active as part of groups like the Women of Colour Network means that these issues don't drop off the agenda. And I think, being able to raise those issues in your workplace is an important thing. And if you can't, then networks can be, Women of Colour Network in particular can be a place that you can go to get advice about what to do.
Yeah, thank you for that. Certainly from my perspective, when I started working in the early 90s, I started working in the corporate sector. And I have to say, my work at the time was in the financial services sector, and then the funds management, and then the banking sector. It certainly was very male-dominated and quite Anglo-male-dominated. From my experience, sometimes it's something that you can feel, but you can't actually quantify, you can't actually catch it. You can certainly feel the discrimination, but you can't put to it what exactly it is in order for you to take the next step. If I was brave enough, and I don't know whether I was at that time, even if I had some tangible example or experience of that, but I certainly felt it. You felt that you were certainly overlooked, and you felt not quite on the equal footing with your counterparts. What did I do to overcome that? I'm not sure. I don't know whether I actually was prepared or equipped, but what I did do was I found myself some ambassadors, and they were quite diverse in terms of gender, cultural backgrounds, and different walks of lives. The advice that I would give to young females from different cultural backgrounds now who feel overlooked for work and so on and so forth, I think today, like you, Niki, the legislative landscape is far more supportive, and there are different avenues that women of different cultural backgrounds can access. And you've mentioned the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission. I think the networks are certainly important. Coming together to support each other, to have that collective support, to me is really important, that you are not alone in dealing with these sorts of issues. For me, that's really important. And just finally, as we bring to a close of our first episode, Niki, what do you hope for the future?
Well, I think the statements associated with International Women's Day this year, I would love to see a gender equal Victoria. I mean, I was going to say world. I think the latest estimates are that we're 135 years away from a gender equal world. But I'd love to see a gender equal Victoria. And I think this Gender Equality Act gives us the first kind of glimpses of that being a possibility. I know it only covers the public sector, but it will provide an example of how auditing, measuring, taking action, requiring reasonable and material progress can put a rocket under gender equality, which has been so incredibly slow. It's changing, but it's changing at a snail's pace, and I would love to see us really put a rocket under movement in that regard for Victorians and as an example for other sectors and other jurisdictions as well.
Well, I don't know about you, audience, but with Dr. Niki Vincent at the helm of this legislation, I'm sure we'll be getting this far sooner than 130-something years you've mentioned, Niki. Thank you so much, Dr. Niki Vincent, for being our guest on our first podcast episode of Conversations with Commissioners. It's been fantastic, inspirational. And my name is Vivienne, and you've been listening to Conversations with Commissioners. Thank you for your company.